angle on that. Okay, recording in progress. This is good.
Hello, everyone. Before I start, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Tahir Garanamli. I'm a graduate student at Eastern Illinois University. I'm taking my master's degree in sustainability with focus on energy management. Today, I will be presenting to you my recent research, which is about renewable electricity and political affiliation in the United States, if there is any kind of connection or relation between both. So let's get started with our first variable. When it comes to renewable electricity, I obtained my data from the United States Environmental Protection Agency, something known as EPA. And from that, I can get access to their eGrid database. Now, the eGrid database is basically open source. You can find it on the website. All you have to do is filter what kind of data you're looking for. So in my case, I want to explore total generation in megawatt hour, because I'm considering electricity from all renewable and non-renewable fuels at a state level and for the year 2020. And as we go to the next slide, you know why I selected 2020 in particular.
Before you go to the next slide, Texas is #1. I just want to highlight.
Yeah. As for my second variable, which is political affiliation, I used the Federal Election Commission data, and I focused in particular on the 2020 presidential results, which has been between plenty of parties, but the major two parties were the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, each represented by Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Jumping to the hypothesis, but before I do that, allow me to highlight some indicators that allowed me to phrase the hypothesis the way I did. Okay. And let's start with the first hypothesis. First indicator, sorry. So there's the Clean Power Plan, or CPP. It's a plan signed by President Barack Obama in 2015, which aimed to reduce carbon emissions by carbon emissions by coming from electricity generation by 32% by 2030. While President Barack Obama described it as a moral obligation, President Trump described it as a job-killing regulation. Jumping to my second indicator, the EIA, or the Energy Information Administration. This administration has sorted the US states based on their CO2 emissions per capita in the year 2016. And this is the list that it came up with, starting with states like Wyoming, North Dakota, and states like Rhode Island, California, and New York. What I want to emphasize here is that the top 23 states, all of them except for one, voted for Donald Trump in 2016. My third indicator, this is a study which analyzed the 2016 presidential campaigns between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. This study, what it did is it counted the times the word climate change was brought up by each of these campaigns. While the Democratic Party brought it up 246 times, the Republican nominees brought up the word climate change 39 times only. My final indicator, before I go to the hypothesis, is related to the renewable portfolio standards, which are state policies aimed to increase the use of renewable resources in generating electricity. And when you look at the map over there, all the states that are colored in blue, all of them have adopted renewable portfolio standards. All the yellow states have adopted renewable portfolio goals. Meanwhile, states that have not adopted, states colored in white have not adopted, have not adopted the standards nor the goals. I want you to look at that map and let's compare it with the 2020 presidential election map. Look carefully with me. When you look at the map on the left, you can see that all the states that have voted for Joe Biden, which are colored in blue, all of them, except for Georgia, have adopted renewable portfolio standards. Also, all the states that are colored in white on the map on the right here, all of them, except for Georgia, have voted for Donald Trump in 2020. By these indicators that I illustrated here, my hypothesis states as following. The more Republican vote share per state tends to lead to less use of renewable fuels to generate electricity compared to non-renewable fuels. Let's jump directly to the findings. I'm sure that everybody's exhausted now. So I have this map, this graph right here. My x-axis represents the renewable electricity share, which is defined as the renewable electricity as a ratio of total electricity. My y-axis represents the presidential Republican vote share, which is defined as the Republican votes divided by the total votes. Now, what I'm expecting right here are 50 dots, each dot representing a state. Now, based on the hypothesis that I shared with you, the more Republican vote share will lead to less renewable electricity share. So I'm expecting some kind of negative relationship here. But what happens is this. 50 dots scattered in the middle, you can't find out if there's a relationship or not. To give more sense of this, I inserted a linear trend line. It's a very slight relationship, a slight negative relationship based on this. To do more analysis on this, we can see that there is a cluster of states on the left side of the graph compared to the right side of the graph. As a matter of fact, we can see that 25 states out of the 50, which is half of the states, generate less than 15% of their electricity from renewable resources. Let me say it again. So half of the states generate less than 15% of their electricity from renewable resources. We can see that also on the 50% line, that only 8 states generate more renewable than non-renewable. And from these 8 states, we can find that 4 of them are Republican and 4 of them are Democrat. The Republican states are Montana, Iowa, Idaho, and South Dakota. The Democratic states are Oregon, Washington, Maine, and Vermont. The conclusions and recommendations. Based on the data that I have used, we can state that there is no significant relationship between renewable electricity and political affiliation in the United States. Being a Republican state or a Democratic state does not necessarily mean that you will generate more in renewable or not. My recommendation, based, as you can see, my data was focused only on 1 year, which is 2020. However, a broader study or further study should also include years before 2020 and years after to see if there's some kind of a relationship or a trend over this period. I thought that maybe a state's geographical location and renewable energy potential could play an important role in determining whether it will invest more in renewable resources or not. So I just did a quick research on this, just on one aspect, which is solar energy. So I use this map, which is from a reliable source, the NREL. This map shows the direct normal solar irradiance. So dark red means more solar irradiance per meter square. Bright yellow means less solar irradiance per meter square. So if you want to have a suntan, you know where to go in that case. So I use the data in this map with the use of some GIS tools to come up with this graph. This graph shows you on the x-axis the average solar irradiance received from solar light, the solar energy. On the y-axis represents the solar electricity generated. Each of these states, each of these dots are states in this case. Why did I want to use this? To see if maybe some states generate, how can I say, some states are taking advantage more than other states when it comes to solar generation. So, any idea what's the outline on the top over there?
Texas.
No, not Texas.
Where?
Excuse me?
Hawaii.
No, not Hawaii. That's California. Okay. So let's compare the state on the right, which is Texas. So what I want to see here is that although California receives less solar irradiance than Texas, it yet generates more solar electricity. Compare it, let's make another example with North Carolina and New Mexico. Although North Carolina receives less solar irradiance on a state level than New Mexico, yet it generates more solar generation. So even the geographical location and the potential might not be necessary to define if a state will generate more renewable electricity or not. This is my end of my presentation. Thank you very much for having me on this conference. It's my first time, so thank you very much.
Tiffany, you can go ahead and get started with your presentation.
She's always online.
She's online. She's been there.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, third time.
Awesome. Third time's the charm.
Tiffany, you're muted.
Now you can hear me.
Yes, and are you showing anything on your screen right now?
Yes.
Oh.
Very good, thank you.
So her other research interest.
Seems like we can see you and you can hear us and we can see your slide.
Okay, now it's working. For some reason, it doesn't let me present and unmute at the same time, but now I think it's working finally. Good afternoon, everyone. Today I will be presenting on bioplastics and plastics and doing a comparative analysis. So, with the great rise for need for social change within our culture and our overdependence on plastic, environmental activists such as Greta Thunberg are raising awareness on the long-term effects of this issue. There are many solutions to this issue, such as switching to zero waste initiatives, switching to more recyclable materials such as aluminum, or using the newest technology to produce a suitable alternative. Technology is an ever-present aspect of our increasingly connected lives. Whether we want to deny it or not, we are dependent on technology to make our lives easier, cheaper, and faster. Because the technology we produce today has the potential to affect billions of people in the coming years, it is critical that we use our resources wisely. This is where bioplastic innovation steps in, analyzing the life cycle of three varying levels of sustainability in plastic polymers. The first is our traditional polyethylene terephthalate, so PET, which is just a long word for the traditional plastic that we are accustomed to. Another hybrid biopetroleum polymer is assessed, biopolyethylene terephthalate, BPET, and this is made from fossil fuel feedstock and one biological feedstock. I then analyzed PHA from fermented sugars, in this case, corn. And so while one hand we have water bottle packaging, for example, this is a very easy life cycle to trace. In fact, many of these companies are accused of greenwashing and claim to be environmentally friendly when they are actively continuing to use plastic packaging. For example, many companies claim to be ISO 1400. To explain what the ISO does, it establishes standards for businesses and institutions to obtain accreditation in a variety of areas. This ISO 1400 defines the standard for low carbon footprint. This is recognized as the guideline for environmental management systems. The ISO will assist businesses in meeting their aims and goals, as it is one of the most detail-oriented systems to operate under. The ISO 1400 standard may be used to any sort of corporation. It straddles the line between ecological responsibility and management systems for partners. With the increasing number of firms becoming green these days, it is unquestionably necessary for businesses to have some form of sustainability strategy in place in order for consumers to trust them. The ISO 1400 standard is the best answer since it provides detailed guidelines for enterprises of all sizes to follow. These ISO 14001 principles apply to infrastructure since the primary objective is to provide resources efficiently, as that is the basic purpose of all infrastructure management. The ISO 1400 also uses the PDCA framework to determine systems over time and has tight controls in place to assist enterprises and organizations to become more responsible and ensure the sustainability of water, air, and land. So first, as you can see, we have BPET, which is an alternative to the more commonly used PET in water bottles. It is made from one fossil fuel feedstock and one biological feedstock. In a study comparing the sustainability for various biodegradable and traditional plastic packaging, BPET in a study of 12 different plastic types ranked number 8 in Green Design rank and number 12 in an LCA rank. Sustainability metrics. For cumulative energy demand, it scored 146.2. It consists of a low score of 15% of renewable materials compared to a 0% in regular PET bottles and 100% in PLA and PHA. However, in terms of recovery or how much can be actually recycled, it only scored an 18% compared to other materials. It also is relatively cheaper than other materials, coming at only $4.13 for each liter. And finally, BPET is also very high scored in atomic economy, which is another way to say waste prevention. It is calculated by dividing mass of input by mass of product. BPET scored a relatively medium score of 62%. The cons of BEPT was that it had the greatest impact in terms of ecotoxicity and potential to cause cancer in humans. This is because it's largely based on ethanol production from sugarcane. Ethanol has been known to produce cancerous cells, but since it is not being directly ingested by humans, it is not a common issue. However, it is still important to note that exposure to sublethal ethanol concentrations causes DNA replication stress and increased mutation rate, as noted by a medical journal. Ultimately, sustainability should include concerns about human health and not just the environment. On to PLA plastic. PLA plastic is so promising that you probably have already used them in biodegradable and compostable packaging and single-use cutlery at your local restaurant. It is incredibly durable considering it is bio-based plastic, as there are many biodegradable packaging that gets undurable after a while and doesn't hold up to the quality of their plastic counterpart. In addition, just to define exactly what biodegradable means, the bioplastics are considered compostable if within 180 days, a complete microbial assimilation of the fragmented food sources take place in a compost. The synthesis of PLA can be accomplished in 3 steps: by microbial fermentation, purification by lactic preparation, and finally polycondensation. PLAG came in 4th place in a study of 12 distinct plastic types for green design and 9th place in a life cycle assessment. It also received a 98.3 for total energy demand, a high score of 100% renewable energies, and a 0% average low score in terms of recovery. It is considered more costly than other materials, where it comes around 4.6 USD per liter. This explains why many businesses are hesitant to implement PLAG. And finally, it received great marks in atomic economy and got an 80% score, which is considered an average. On the cons of PLAG, it should be noted that since it is an agriculturally based product, agriculture needs to keep up to keep up with the demand. Obviously, farming presents its own sets of issues such as nitrogen runoff, excess CO2 production, and some other current challenges include some cost feasibility, sustainable grown biomass, lack of adequate labeling, composting programs and infrastructure, as well as concerns over contamination of recycling systems. We are moving on to the PHG analysis, and this was ranked 2nd in a study for green design and 9th in a life cycle evaluation. It also got a whooping energy demand of 91.5. It has a perfect score of 100% renewable materials, and when opposed to the other materials, it got a 0% average low score in terms of recovery, or how much can be salvaged. This is the most costly of the materials, estimated to cost $6.2 per liter. This illustrates why many enterprises remain hesitant to deploy PHG because it lowers overall revenue. Finally, it received an 80% in overall score and an atomic economy of 48%. In my opinion, it depends on what is being produced to determine which bioplastic will be the best. However, given the cost restraints, transportation restraints, and production restraints, PLAs are the best options, given that it is the cheaper option out of the ones analyzed as well. Given the great strides we have achieved since the previous industrial age, it is difficult to envision a future without the technology we far too accept as normal. Innovation is inherently altering the way we think, but it is wise to note that we can alter how we think about what we possess as well. We have the option of maximizing all of these plastic resources, and why wouldn't we choose to seize this power to protect the resources that we have for coming generations? This exemplifies why we must continue supporting sustainable plastic production. This and other resources to enhance ecological integrity, not because it is convenient, but because it is the morally right thing to do. Finally, by leveraging bioplastic innovation, we as a society may accomplish durable and beneficial progress. When there is a great garbage patch that still is remaining stagnant in the ocean with no progress in its removal, it is important to note that plastic pollution is a problem that we are taking on day by day. Thank you, and I now open the floor to any questions.
Why don't we go ahead and get to the next speaker, which also has to do with water.
Next, if we could have Yishan Ma, and you can start your presentation.
Ocean, it turns out that one of the problems of the oceans is, of course, plastic waste. So, maybe these two do connect. Are we ready for Yishuan Ma? Is that who's coming up? I think
Yes,
that-
hello.
Krishna,
Hi.
we see your
Can
picture.
you hear me?
We see you, yes.
Okay, wonderful. And I'm sharing my screen. It might take a few seconds. Okay. All right. So hi everyone, my name is Ishan. I'm doing communication studies, but I have a huge passion for sustainability. Therefore, I'm presenting one of my recent research on ocean acidification, which is an increasingly acute issue in ocean sustainability management. And in this research, I am primarily utilizing a qualitative review and analysis of ocean acidification international conventions. I acknowledge that I'm currently in a preliminary stage of the research. However, I thought it might be helpful to discuss a little bit more about ocean acidification, as this field is sort of being understudied in the field of communications, and also in sustainability studies. So to start off my presentation, I'd like to give an overview of what is ocean acidification and what are some of its potential implications. So ocean acidification is an emerging topic concerning global environmental sustainability, and it can actually be traced back to the beginning of Industrial Revolution, where the human activities such as fossil fuel burning has led to an augmentation in the emissions of carbon dioxide, raising the amount of our atmospheric CO2 absorbed by the ocean. And this has really boosted the ocean's carbonic acid concentrations and reduced its pH level, known as ocean acidification, or OA. And today the ocean is acidifying at an unprecedentedly high rate, which is extremely high. That is higher than any time in the Earth's history, according to IGBP in 2013. And speaking of its potential damages and its challenges posing to our society, the ocean acidification weakens the ocean's capacity to absorb atmospheric CO2 and also its function in tempering climate change. And OA also damages the marine organisms' ability to build and also to maintain their shells and skeletons, therefore decreasing the survival rate and also the growth rate of these marine organisms. And this effect extends to fisheries, aquaculture, coastal management, and tourism, threatening the entire food web and the socioeconomic stability, particularly in the societies that are largely ocean dependent. And therefore, it is really essential to build ecological and also social resilience to adapt to ocean acidification, which means that CO2 emissions should be drastically reduced to inherently attenuate OA and its far-reaching effects. And in the following slides, I would be focusing on the following topics, including the actors, groups, and their positions in terms of combating ocean acidification. And then this will be followed by some institutions, norms, and the current practices regarding the regulation and attenuation of ocean acidification. And then finally, I would do a brief analysis of the effectiveness of the current governance arrangements that are currently in place. So to start off, I would like to talk about the actors, groups, and their positions. So a plethora of the actors or groups has been involved in the response to ocean acidification. And speaking of the private sector, we can see that fossil fuel companies have been major carbon producers and OA contributors. Decreasing carbon footprints will lead to revenue losses, which has prevented them from making fundamental changes. And this has been a total absence of private corporation representatives in the International Alliance to Combat Ocean Acidification. And as a result, the private sector generally has very limited awareness regarding ocean acidification as a global sustainability problem. And then if we analyze from the national level, a lot of the island and coastal countries, they hold very proactive motivations to alleviate ocean acidification and its extensive effects, whereas other countries that are more hesitant to take action. Furthermore, the countries dependent on carbon-intensive industries, they still tend to have weaker motivations since decarbonizing may result in a lot of short-term disruptions or substantial economic cost and social instability. And nonetheless, in the globalization era of increasing interconnectedness and interdependence, ocean acidification constantly affects all countries ubiquitously. And then finally, speaking of some of the international intergovernmental organizations that have the primary advocates for ocean acidification related awareness and the actions. For example, the UNGA, they have supported initiatives that would address ocean acidification and encourage the global collaborative efforts to monitor, to observe, and also to prevent further acidification, as well as to enhance the ecosystem and social resilience. And the UNGA has also launched a couple of initiatives, such as the Ocean Acidification International Coordination Center, to advance scientific research and to foster international collaboration. And moreover, the emphasis on ocean acidification during the UN conferences like Rio+20 encouraged the state to put in this issue onto their agenda and also elaborate on governance arrangements. Therefore, we can see that IGOs can use their international political influence to unify the efforts of OA-sensitive states, to reconcile with less sensitive countries to achieve compatible transnational agreements. And IGOs can also use their capabilities to translate OA knowledge into initiatives to facilitate the concrete advancements in international agreements and state-led policies to promote commitments from the private and the public actors. And then let's dive into some of the institutions, norms, and current practices that are in place in terms of ocean acidification regulation. So the oldest international convention can be traced back to 1942, the London Convention, which is known as LC. It was established in the 1970s. And then the LC and the LP, they had annual meetings to discuss marine-related issues and also the corresponding regulations. The 2009 amendment explicitly reiterates the concern pertinent to OA's implications for the marine environment due to the elevated status of CO2 in the atmosphere. And there's also a prohibition of the dumping of all waste and other matters. And this legally binds all contracting parties to ban the disposal of CO2 and also to create a regulatory mechanism for ocean fertilization that has the potential to increase the ocean's acidity. And in addition, the amendment acknowledges the practice of carbon sequestration in seabed geological formations to permanently isolate CO2 and to prevent further acidification. And then in 1994, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, they entered into force to regulate all aspects of the marine environment's resources and to foster their stability. This umbrella convention, ratified by 168 countries, includes the international governance of acidification. And firstly, it indicates that the state should take measures to protect and also to preserve rare or fragile ecosystems, as well as the habitat of the depleted, threatened, or endangered species and other forms of marine life, signaling the country's responsibility to enhance ecosystems resilience. And then secondly, the UNCLOS also points out that the state should take measures to prevent, reduce, and also to control pollutions on the marine environment, including pollution from or through the atmosphere. And this means that the atmospheric CO2 should be reduced to prevent further acidification. And these are the binding norms of customary international law and hence legally obligatory for all countries, including the ones that have not yet ratified or signed the convention. And then speaking of some of the most recent initiatives, we would say about in 2020, the Agreement on the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Marine Biological Diversity of Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction, which is known as BBNG, was concluded. And as an international legally binding instrument, the BBNG agreement emphasizes cooperation amongst the states to establish marine protected areas, therefore conserving the diversity and also the abundance of marine species. And meanwhile, it also highlights the importance of conducting environmental impact assessment beyond national jurisdiction, enabling accurate evaluation of activities' influences on the environment, and also signaling the harmful ones that would intensify acidification. Now let's have a look at some of my qualitative interpretations of the international conventions. So first of all, some political battles have arisen surrounding the subject. The carbon-heavy countries, they remain deeply penetrated by fossil fuel traders, have demonstrated very significantly strong opposing attitudes since they are not willing to restrict economic growth for marine environment protection. And this forms a very sharp contrast with the situation in Norway, which is committed to both conventions and adopted the corresponding strategies into their national jurisdictions. And therefore, at the same time, this is because they rely less on industrial activities. And then secondly, favorably, the UNCLOS has generated an agreement among all states regarding the high seas, lessening the worry about the sovereignty and also setting a foundation for international governance. And then thirdly, Both of the conventions that I mentioned before, they incorporate the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. And therefore, this principle assigns leading efforts to the developed countries since they have more historical responsibilities and also more resources, therefore affirming greater equality when dealing with this universal challenge. And then let's have a look at the effectiveness of the governance arrangements. So despite the progress in addressing ocean acidification in international governance arrangements, the results remain very inadequate. The overarching criteria for the effectiveness of ocean acidification regulation are the levels of atmospheric CO2 and ocean pH. And based on the data from 2013, we can see that the atmospheric CO2 levels have increased and the ocean pH has decreased, both at a rate comparable to before the convention signature. So this implies that ocean acidification has continued to develop and to intensify at the rate which is really comparable to the decades prior to the signature of the conventions, and the effectiveness of the current governance arrangements came into place and becomes highly restricted. And then under these ineffective arrangements, the key challenges remain unsolved. Certain states' reluctance to enter and to implement conventions contribute to the ineffectiveness. And specifically, the LC and the LP, they do not have a mechanism to ensure the entry of all countries and also lack the means to incentivize parties to ratify. The countries that do not acknowledge the magnitude of ocean acidification and also the necessity of transnational corporations tend to flee from bearing their international responsibilities. And furthermore, besides the influence on international reputation, these conventions do not have sanction mechanisms to enforce states' compliance with the governance of ocean acidification, and therefore trigger further free rider problems. The countries still have the incentive to violate the rules since this allows them to gain advantages without bearing the cost of their share of the efforts. And to reverse this situation, the conventions should develop proper sanction mechanisms that are neither too flexible nor too stringent. Therefore, to avoid putting too much pressure on the current and the political potential contracting parties. And concurrently, this would enable identifying and also imposing penalties for OA-related non-compliance activities to strengthen the fairness and also the effectiveness of the governance. And then in addition, regulations for ocean acidification are having a high level of ambiguity and overlapping in an area of international governance arrangements. The LC and the LP, they explicitly specify the necessity to tackle ocean acidification and provides a series of prohibitions and methods, but they are only applicable to the contracting states and therefore unable to mobilize all the countries across the globe. And in contrast, the UNCLOS assign operationalizing obligations to all states, but they do not explicitly acknowledge ocean acidification as a global issue. So with different levels of relevance, direct responses to ocean acidification are insufficient and largely fragmented, lacking the coordination to address this global challenge in a holistic manner. And this complicates the collaborative actions to combat ocean acidification, resulted in very limited effectiveness. And to redeem this situation, international organizations and also IGOs with significant international political influences should advocate for the design and implementation of a unifying agreement or standalone mechanism, specifically and also comprehensively responding to rising ocean acidity. And marine biodiversity and climate change interconnected with ocean acidification should also be taken into consideration. So to conclude,
we're 13-minute point of your 10-minute presentation. 13
Okay.
minutes, so quickly.
Yeah, it's a very short conclusion and I'm done. So the challenge of ocean acidification remain far beyond sufficiently addressed in national policies and by private actors. Many international conventions have made progress in deploying global collaborative efforts to cultivate greater resilience and also to control CO2 emissions to prevent further acidification. But however, with the everlasting political battle and also the lack of sanction mechanisms, some states have demonstrated very reluctant attitudes toward dedicating their fair share of the global efforts. And therefore, this inconsistent, ambiguous coordination increases the complexity for international and also national communities to address the rising acidity with clarity and uniformity. And therefore, the current international governance arrangements remain largely inadequate to bring the issue into sharp focus and for effective relief, opposing serious challenges for developing a very sustainable future. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you. I know I'm running a little bit over time, but thank you so much for listening.
So
we have one more speaker, or do we have one more? Okay, we are actually available to answer questions for any of these speakers. And even though that she had a very big topic and spoke very quickly, we're back on schedule. We're just normally late now. So do we have any questions for anybody? Thank you very much for that presentation, though. I'm very interested. I think the oceans affect all of us. So who will ask the first? This is your chance.
Thank you very much. Yes, I have a comment to the presentation, and I enjoyed it very much. And I feel that you can find your relationship, but you need to add a third dimension. Let's say, just start with making the grouping of the states in order to find some specific to them, and then start see your relationship. Maybe it's also the question of going lower with this division of the administrative division of the country, but it's also the question of the data, if you have the same data for the countries as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Indeed, it's a good question, actually. Just putting like political affiliation alone and comparing it with the, for example, in my case, the United States on a state level, it wouldn't be logical, because there are plenty of factors playing here. And I just show you like a geographical aspect about it also is different. So as you said, like you need like an equation that involves politics, geography, name it. So all of them together, in that case, maybe a better result would be concluded in that case. Yeah. And when it comes to globally, I think that, as you said, it's about data. The United States country that records almost any data that it has, which is very good because you can build on it. But when it comes to worldwide, you need to find data, and that data needs to be reliable to build on. So, in the United States, you have like Democrats and Republicans. Globally, it's difficult, you know, like to put each country on the political spectrum and to define how we would go, whether on the left wing or the right wing, would be difficult. But this is what I could do, but hopefully it was useful by the end of the day. Thank you for your question once again.
We have another question?
Yeah, sure. I don't know if you have, I was out for a second, but one thing which was intriguing me was, you know, your the data when we're talking about political orientation in states, and then all of a sudden we found out a neutral zone on the issue of the climate itself. So individually, can you deduce from it that Americans internally are the same, but as a group, they show this superficial culture which divides them, but inside they are the same.
Indeed, being an international student, the indicators that I showed you, like, okay, everything shows to be like Republicans or red states. They always go to the oil industry, gas industry, coal, that industry, all of that, and they don't prefer like renewable resources. That's the assumption that I had, and that's what I showed the indicator. But the data shows something else, at least with the data that I use. Yeah, it was surprising to me. Like I found like when it came like a neutral relationship, I went back to the data and maybe there's something wrong because it was very different from what I was expecting.
Yes, but I have a second question. You've done this 2020.
Yes.
This is a neutral zone. This is neither the former government nor the incoming government. It's kind of in the middle. So is it possible to assume that the political climate, in fact, draws them together into some kind of convergence of their thoughts?
Yes, the reason I selected 2020 in particular because it's the year of elections, presidential elections. So that year I have the results. It could change like in 2021, 2022, but I don't have the data for that. That's why we use 2020 in particular. Thank you.
So I'm going to take the opportunity of the session chair to say, I see something in common in your paper, Professor Garmanley, and the one about ocean acidification. It seems like to me, the ocean acidification paper, one main theme of that was all these government agreements doesn't matter, governments don't matter. It seems like your paper left me with the feeling that governments don't matter. Certainly political affiliation, state doesn't matter. State is not the unit to look at. And that reminds me of something I learned in China many years ago. There's a phrase in China that's been around for thousands of years, but it can be summarized today. Beijing is very far away. What they really mean is the emperor is very far away. So I think it's the unit of analysis should be less than states and maybe less than what governments do, just in my case.
Maybe that would be a good suggestion to work on.
Any other comments or questions? If not, we have a chance now to do what, Mike? We have, what are we doing?
Round table.
So what?
Round table session.
So find a table, find a table that has at least one human with it.
All right, well, thanks, John. Thanks for-
So in terms of our roundtable sessions, we're gonna have roundtable 2.7.4 over here with Dr. Ping. The title is Navigating Between Nuclear Winter and Rural Transformation.
Oh, round table one's here, so okay. Oh,
Just
yeah,
stay where
come
you
on,
are.
let's see, come on here, yes.
We just clean.
And then we have roundtable 2.7.5. You can go to the table next to them and we'll be discussing managing ethical economies, green human resource management, location choices, and process mining. And at this table right here, we have roundtable 2.7.6, which is overcoming supply chain challenges. If you do not have the link to any of the roundtables, and you'd like to see our virtual participants,
Take it away,
go ahead
Mike.
and find me and I'll be able to add you to the roundtable session on Zoom.
All right, thank you, Ari. I think we're,
And last chance for any food and beverages because they are taking the lead.
John, hi. Can you hear me? John Ellison, can you hear me? John, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Can we see you? Jimmy, you come here. You are the in-person roundtable customer. John, can we see you?
Yes, I've turned on the camera, but I don't know what's happening.
Okay, so well, if you cannot, that's fine.
Turned on the camera.
So just
Turned on the camera.
okay, so just to have a roll call, we have John Ellison here. He is the author of paper 1, and then Clara. We see no Clara, and there's a bunch of authors for paper 3, but we don't see them here. And then paper 4, we have one author, Jiming Wang. He is here with me.